Hello everyone. Our next module is about the skeletal system, which is also known as osseous system. So the skeleton. So skeleton is what? A framework of the joint bones that forms a supporting structure of the body. It helps in what? To stand straight, to move, to perform and physical activity, which helps in breathing. So, first is the introduction. The skeleton is also intricates what? The functionally with the cardiovascular system as a very second millions of the fresh blood cells poured out of the bone marrow. So, a healthy diet that provides enough minerals, especially calcium, along with the regular moderate exercise, can reduce the risk of bone. So, this skeleton system study is also known as the osteology, which is a study of bones and teeth. So, here are some interesting facts about the skeleton. The skeleton makes up of almost about one-fifth of all the healthy body weights. So the bones or the bone density actually contributes in the weight of a human being. So it actually comprises of what? The inner framework, which helps in the support of the tissues and the other organs, which would collapse without the skeletal reinforcement. It helps in the protection of delicate organs like brain inside the skull. Bones are the reservoirs of the minerals, especially what? The calcium. This calcium helps in making up of cells for the blood. Bone is an active tissue, and even though it is about 22% water, it has an extremely strong yet lightweight and flexible structure. So it is extremely strong, but it is lightweight and it is very sturdy in structure with flexibility. So a similar frame made for high technology composite material could not match the skeleton's weight, strength, and durability. So even if the skeleton system is our biological element, any high technology components cannot withstand with the skeleton of our human body. So it is as strong as steel but light as aluminium. So it can help in repairment if it is damaged. It can remodel if the bones are cracked and strengthen them in areas of extra stress. So in human being, the adult human is having a bone of 206 and it comprises of what? The cartilage and ligaments. So the skeleton is the framework that provides structure to the rest of the body and facilitates the movement. So the human skeleton is 206 bones and 32 teeth. The human skeleton also includes the ligaments and the cartilage. So, what are ligaments and cartilage? Ligaments are band like. So this is the skeleton system. Here we can see the ligaments, and here is the cartilage, and these are the bones. So, the bones or the skeletal system is having the bones, cartilages, and the ligaments. So, these ligaments are the band like structure which are having a fibrous connective tissue that are the key function of the joints. So this ligaments actually helps in the movement of the joints with the respect of that bone. Then comes the cartilage. Cartilage are the more flexible type of element than the bone but stiffer than the muscle. So cartilage is having a flexible property in compare with the bone, but it is also a sturdy than the muscle. It is not as soft as muscle, but it is not as hard as bone. Then cartilage actually helps in giving in what? The structure to the larynx, in this larynx portion, and the nose region. It is also found in the vertebrae and the ends of the bone like the femur, which is the thigh bone. Then comes the ligament. So these are the ligaments. We can see there are many types of ligaments. That is the tibiofibular. That is the tibiofibular ligament. Then the calcaneofibular ligament, and the ligaments connecting the tarsals and the metatarsals of the foot. So ligaments are the strong band-like structure that actually having a fibrous tissue which provides the support to the bones and link the bones in together in and around the joint. So these ligaments are the fibrous like structure or a band like structure that helps in the linkage of between the bone and in around the joint. So they are composed of collagen, which is a tough elastic protein. So collagen are the tough and elastic protein. A large number of ligaments bind together the complex wrist and the ankle joint. A large number of ligaments bind together the complex wrist and the ankle joint. So the ligaments are mainly found in the wrist and the ankle joints. The foot ligaments are the store energy as a stretch when the foot is planted and then impart it again as a recoil and shorten to put a spring in the step. It saves an enormous amount of energy when walking. So this ligament actually is a energy storage compound which actually helps in the recoiling and the shortening of the band, and it helps in what walking in the spring in the step, that is it is forming a spring like mechanism while walking. So there are 22 skull bones, 64 shoulder girdle and the upper limb bones. Vertebral column is consisting of 33 bones. This is the pelvic girdle and the lower limbs. It is consisting of 62 bones. And the thoracic cage along with the sternum is the 25 bones. So the bones are arranged to form the structure. The bones are arranged to form a structure. The skull protects, so this is the skull which protects. Inside this skull, there is what? Brain. So inside the skull, there is brain which protects the brain and gives the shape to the face. Then comes the thoracic cage. So this is the thoracic cage which surrounds the and protects what? The heart and the lungs. Then comes the vertebral column, which mainly known as what? The spine, and is formed of what? 30 small bones. Then there are limbs, that is the upper limb and the lower limb. So upper and the girdles that attach the four limbs to the vertebral column. There is a shoulder girdle and a pelvic girdle. So this shoulder girdle is present in the upper limb and the pelvic girdle is found in the lower limbs. So what is the function of the skeleton? It actually protects the vital organs. So as in the previous slide, I have explained that the brain is surrounded by the bones, that is the hardy vault-like structure, that is the skull. And the heart and lungs are protected by what? The thoracic cavity. So this thoracic cage is actually comprising of what? The sternum. The sternum actually holding what? What? The rib cages. So inside the rib cage, there is heart and lungs. And then comes the vertebral column, which provides what? The structure and the protection for the spinal cord. Then comes the interactions between the skeleton, muscles, and nerves, which move the body. So how does the skeleton move? It actually helped by which structure? The muscles. So these muscles actually throughout the human body are attached to the bone. Nerves are attached around the muscle, which actually accepts the signal, and that signals actually passes to the muscle for the movement. When the nervous system sends commands to the skeleton's muscle, the muscles contract. This contraction produces the movement at the joints between the bones. So bones, actually, the skeletal system are divided into two main division, that is the appendicular skeleton and the axial skeleton. So this is the axial skeleton. Axial skeleton are the upper region of the skeleton system. And appendicular skeleton is the which comprises of what? The upper limb and this lower limb portion of the bone. So bones of the appendicular skeleton facilitate the movement of the shoulder girdles and the pelvic girdles and the upper limb and the lower limb. The bones of the axial skeleton protect the internal organs, that is the skull, the vertebral column. So this is the vertebral column. Then comes the thoracic cage. So this is the thoracic cage. So in this diagram, you can see the appendicular skeleton is marked with the blue color. This blue color is comprising of what? The shoulder girdle. The lower shoulder girdle attaches with the upper limbs, and the pelvic girdle attaches with the lower limb. Then comes the axial skeleton, which is comprising of the skull, the vertebral column, the thoracic cage. Out of which 206 bones, 80 are the axial bones. So along with the skull, vertebral column and thoracic cage, 80 are the total axial skeletal bones. With the 64 bones in the upper appendicular, so there is 64 bones in the upper appendicular and 64 bones in the upper appendicular and 62 bones in the lower appendicular region. So bones can be classified into 5 types. That is the long bone. So this is the long bone. Then comes the flat bone. These are the flat bone. Then comes the sesamoid bone. Then comes the short bone. And this is the irregular bone. So the long bone is actually the example, if we can take, is the femur, which is the thigh bone, and it is present in the lower limb. It is considered to be the longest bone present in our body. Then comes the flat bone, which we can take the example, that is the frontal bone. So this is the frontal bone. This is in the shape of flat. Then comes the sesamoid bone. This is the knee bone or the kneecap, which is also known as patella. So this patella is actually situated where? In between the and the femur and the tibia and fibula. So it is a knee bone or the kneecap, which is in the shape of sesame seeds. So why it is known as sesamoid? As it is withholding the shape of a sesame seed. Then comes the carpals and the tarsals. So carpals are present in the hand and tarsals are present in the feet. So these are known as the short bone. So these are the short bone. Then comes the irregular shaped bone. So these are the irregular shaped bone, and they actually classified under which? The vertebrae. So long bones have 3 main parts. So this is the long bone. If we can dissect it, then we can see a spongy part. Then comes spongy bone, which is surrounded by a compact bone, which is a hard part. and it contains what? A bone marrow where red blood cells are produced and a medullary cavity So bone marrow are comprising of red bone marrow where the red blood cells are formed, and it contains what? Yellow bone marrow. So the outside of the long bone consists of a layer of compact bone which is surrounded by what? The spongy bone. So red bone marrow contains the hematopoietic tissue. That is, hematopoietic tissue means the production of the red blood cell tissue. The chief function of this red bone marrow is to produce all three kinds of blood cell, that is red, white and platelets. At birth, the red bone marrow is present in all parts of the bone, but with the increasing of the age, the long bone actually converts the red bone marrow part into a yellow bone marrow, which actually loses the capacity for forming of red blood cells or the blood making cells. So apart from the long bones, some of the bones also produce the red blood cells. So this is the blue color which actually indicates in the image that the red bone marrow is a soft tissue located in the network of spongy bone tissue inside some of the bones. So these are some of the bones which are having a spongy bone tissue which consists of red bone marrow. So in adults, where are the red bone marrows are present and produce the blood cells. So in the adults, the red bone marrow produce the blood cells of the cranium, vertebrae, scapula, that is the shoulder bone, sternum, this one is the sternum, then comes the ribs, these are the ribs, then comes the pelvis and the epiphyseal ends of the large long bones. Then comes some joints don't move or very little. So most of the bones in our skeletal system are movable, right? Due to the involvement of the joint. But some part of the bones in our human body are immovable or slightly movable, right? So the examples are firstly the skull. So human skull is not movable. They are immovable. And the part of the skull is actually attached by a structure which is known as the suture, which is the term used for the skull and it is a synonym for the joint, but they are not movable in the skull. So sutures are the types of joint, immovable joint present in the skull. Next come the articulations between the teeth and the mandible. So this immovable joint example another is the teeth and the mandible. So the teeth and the mandible joint are not movable, the teeth and mandible. Then there comes the joint located between the first pair of the ribs and the sternum. So the first pair of the ribs, so suppose this is the ribs, first pair of rib and the sternum is not at all a movable joint. Then comes the example for the slightly movable joint. And the examples are the distal joint between the tibia and fibula. Tibia and the fibula, which is present below the femur bone. This joint actually allow a lot of motion, like the shoulder movement, wrist movement, like the shoulder movement and the wrist movement, and the hip and the ankle movement, and are located in the upper and the lower bones. So the slightly movable joints are actually present in the upper and the lower body portion. Then comes the bones that are having in the infants. Infants have more bones than the adults. Like that is, an infant skeleton has almost 100 more bones than the skeleton of an adult. So normally the human being is having 206 bone. If we add 100 bones, then it becomes what? 306 bones. So infants are having 306 6 bones. At first, it is all flexible but strong cartilage. So, the bones in the infants are flexible in nature, but the cartilages are very strong. So, the bone formation begins at which stage of the development of the infant? That is at about the month of 3 months gestation and continues after birth into the adulthood. So, from the 3 month gestation period to the after the birth of the child into the adulthood. So, for example, the several bones that fuse over time into one bone is the sacrum. So, these several bones which are present in the infant time is actually in the adulthood is infused into which type? In the sacrum. At the birth, the sacrum is 5 vertebrae with the disc in between them. So at the time of birth, the sacrum is having 5 vertebrae with the disc in between them. The sacrum is fully fused into one bone, usually by the fourth decade of life. So examples of the flat bones that protects the internal organs. So flat bones are the skull. So these are the flat bone, example of flat bone. That is the frontal bone, that is the skull bone that contains the occipital bone, the parietal bone, the frontal bone, the nasal bone, the lacrimal and the vomer. Next come the thoracic cage that contains the sternum and the ribs. Next is the pelvis which contains the ilium, ischium and pubis. The function of the flat bones is to protect internal organs such as the brain, heart and pelvic organs. Flat bones actually helps in the protection of the shelled like structure and large areas of the attachment for the bones. Then comes the long bones support weight and facilitate movement. So these long bones, for example, humerus and femur, actually helps in the support of the whole body weight and helps in the facilitation of the movement. So the long bones or the longer than they are wide include the femur. So this femur is the lower limb bone which is considered to be the longest bone in the body. Relatively small bones in the fingers. Then comes the long bones are mostly located in the appendicular skeleton and include. So this long type of bones are actually located in the appendicular skeleton and it includes what? The lower limbs and the upper limbs. The lower limbs and the upper limbs. So lower limbs contains what? The femur and the upper limbs contains what? The humerus. Then comes the short bones. Are cube in shape. So these short bones are actually in the shape of cubes and the short bones are present in the hand and the feet. The hand portion bone is known as carpals. So these are the carpals and the feet portion bones are the tarsals. So these are the tarsals. The short bones are about as long as they are wide, located in the wrist and ankle joints. So as I have told that they are located in the wrist portion, that is the hand portion, and in the feet portion, that is this is the ankle portion of the feet. Short bones provides the stability and some type of movement. The examples of the short bones are the carpals in the wrist and the tarsals in the feet. Then comes the irregular bones that are in complex in shape. So irregular bones are actually the sacrum and the vertebrae. So irregular bones vary in shape and it is having different structure. Therefore, it doesn't fit in the category of flat, short, long and sesamoid bone. They actually having a complex shape and helps in what? The internal organs. For example, vertebrae, irregular bones of vertebral column protects what? The main organ, that is the spinal cord. Then comes the irregular bone. Another example is pelvis, which protects the organs in the pelvic cavity. Then comes the sesamoid bones. Sesamoid bones is also known as what? The patella. Why it is known as sesamoid bone? As it is in the shape of what? A sesame seed. So it is present in between the femur and over the femur and the tibia fibula region, right? So this is the patella. So these small round bones are commonly found in the tendons of the hands, knees, and feet. Sesamoid bones function to protect the tendons from stress and wear. The patella. Patella, commonly known as what? The kneecap, is an example of sesamoid bone. Then comes the skull bones, protect the brain and form an entrance to the body. The skull consists of what? The cranial bones and the facial bones. So this is the skull. This human skull is divided into two parts, right? That is, it is having the cranial bones and this is the facial bone. The facial skeleton, as its name suggests, what it makes the face of the skull. The facial bone actually composes or structures what? The face of the skull. The cranial bones composes of what? The top side and back of the skull. So the top side and the back of the skull is enclosed by the cranial bones and it helps to protect what? The brain. Achha, facial skeleton comprises of what? 14 bones of the facial skeleton and the entrances in the, it helps in the entrances of what? The respiratory tract and the digestive tract. So this 14 facial bones actually helps in the digestion process on the human being and the respiration process. So it is made up of mandible, that is the lower jaw. So this is the mandible, that is the lower jaw. Then the maxilla, the upper jaw, and the zygomatic bones. So zygomatic bones are the cheek bones. So this is the zygomatic bones. This is the upper maxilla bones, and this is the mandible bone. So the bones give the shape to the nasal cavity. Then comes the cranial bones. So there are 8 cranial bones which protects the brain. First is the frontal bone. Then comes the parietal bone. So there is two part of parietal bones. Then comes the occipital bone present backside. So this is the occipital bone present backside. Then comes the temporal bone present beneath the parietal bone. Then comes the sphenoid bone and then ethmoid bone. So this frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal bones are attached with a joint that is known as suture, and these are not movable in nature. Then comes the skull suture. So as I've told you, the skull suture is actually the skull sutures are actually in the newborn or infants. The cranial bones are connected by flexible fibrous sutures, right? So these regions allow the skull to enlarge to accommodate the growing brain. So during the infant or the newborn stage, the brain actually are not so developed, right? So this skull sutures actually provides what? The flexibility or the expansion of the brain skull region for the development of the brain from the childhood to the adulthood. So the sphenoidal and mastoid and posterior frontalis close after 2 months, while the anterior fontanelli may exist for up to 2 years. As the fontanelles close, sutures develop. So after the infant period, when the fontanelles closes, the sutures actually develops. The skull sutures are immobile or immovable joint where the cranial bones are connected with the dense fibrous tissue. The four major cranial sutures are lambdoidal suture, lambdoidal suture, then comes the coronal suture, then comes sagittal suture, and this squamous suture. So this lambdoidal suture is present in between this occipital and this parietal suture. So this portion is the what? The lambdoidal suture. Then comes the coronal suture. Coronal suture actually is the suture or the position which holds this frontal and these two parietal bones. So this frontal and this parietal bone are attached with the coronal suture. Then comes the sagittal suture. Sagittal suture actually withholds the two lobes or the two parts of the parietal bone. So this two part of the parietal bone actually joins the two bones. That is the sagittal suture. Next come the squamous sutures, which is present between the temporal and parietal bone. So this is the temporal and this is the parietal bone. So this is the squamous suture, which is holding the temporal and the parietal bones. And one thing you must remember, so all these sutures are known as the joints of the cranium, but they are not movable. They actually holds or attaches the parts of the bone present in the skull. And this actually during the infant to the adulthood actually helps in expanding the cranium region for the development of the brain. Next come the hyoid bone, laryngeal skeletal bone. The bones of the inner ear are commonly categorized with the skull bones. So bones of the inner ear. So bone of the inner ear consists of steps, incus and malleus. So steps is also known as what? The smallest bone in the body. And the largest bone or longest bone is what? The femur, and the smallest bone in our body is the step. So this is the steps, which is the smallest bone in our body present in the inner ear. So these three bones actually joint with each other and transfer the vibrations from the tympanic or eardrum to the inner ear. So it actually helps in what? The articulation of the bones in malleus, incus and steps, and it actually receives what? The vibration from the air medium and transferring to where? The tympanic membrane or the ear. Then comes the laryngeal skeleton, also known as the larynx. So this portion is the larynx. Larynx is also known as what? The voice box, or it is also known as what? The Adam's apple. So in above the larynx, one bone is known as the hyoid bone. It is also known as the neck bone. It is composed of 9 cartilages and it is located between the trachea and the root of the tongue. Thus, the hyoid bone provides what? The attachment point. The movement of this bone both open and close the epiglottis and regulates the degree of tension of the vocal folds, which when air is forced through them produce vocal sounds. The bones of the vertebral column, the vertebrae, sacrum and the coccyx. The vertebral column is flexible. So this is the vertebrae which consists of sacrum and coccyx. So 24 vertebrae bones are there. It is commonly known as what? The spine. The vertebral column extends from the base of the skull. So base of the skull to the pelvis region. The spinal cord passes from the foramen magnum of the skull through the vertebral canal. So it comprised of 5 regions: cervical spine, thoracic spine, lumbar spine, sacral spine, and coccygeal spine. So spine function is, it is a S-shaped like structure and it acts like a spring and can flex when we are young and jump off to something. So this spine actually helps in jumping mechanism. And it also withheld the body in straight up or the down position, and it can easily be broken down if any injury or accident occurs. So here we can see in this diagram. So there is a cervical vertebrae which composed of 7 bones, thoracic vertebrae which composed of 12 bones, lumbar vertebrae it composed of 5 bones, sacrum vertebrae which is fused with 5 bones, and coccyx is 4 bones. Then comes the spinal joint. So the spinal joints do not have a wide range of movement, but they still allow the spine great flexibility, letting it arc backward, twist, and curve forward. Two facet joints are there, help to prevent slippage and torsion. The bones of the thoracic cage actually helps in the protection of what the internal organs like the heart and the lungs, and it helps in the mechanism of respiration of our body. The sternum is composed of, so this is the sternum which composed of the manubrium, body of the sternum, and the xiphoid process. The ribs are of 1 to 7. They are known as 1 to 7 ribs are known as true ribs, and they articulate directly to the sternum. So these 7 true ribs are attaches directly to the sternum. Rest of the 8 to 12 ribs are known as the false ribs. So these are the false ribs. So this bones comes together types of joints in human body, like the joints hold the skeleton together and support movement. There are two ways of categorizing the joints. The first is by joint function, also referred to as range of motion. The second way to classify it by the material that holds the bone of the joints together. That is an organization of the joints by suture. So joints are of three types present: skull sutures, knee, and the vertebrae. The skull sutures are the immovable joints. Knee joints are full movement joint like the synovial joint or the hinge joint. Then comes the vertebrae, that some movement are there and it is a cartilaginous joint. So fibrous joint, most of these have thick connective tissue between them, which is why most are immovable. There are three types of fibrous joints. Sutures are non-moving joints that connect the bones of the skull. And the syndesomosis is a joint in which a ligament connects to bones, allowing for a little movement. Then comes the cartilaginous joint. Joints that unite bones with the cartilage are called cartilaginous joints. There are two types of cartilaginous joint, that is the synchrodesis is an immovable cartilaginous joint. One example is the joint between the first pair of the ribs and the sternum. And this symphysis consists of a compressible fibrocartilaginous pad that connects two bones such as the hip bones and the vertebrae. Then comes the synovial joints. Synovial joints are characterized by the presence of capsule between the two joint bones. So the synovial joints are present in between the two joint bones and forms a capsule-like structure. So the bone surface at the synovial joints are protected by a coating of articular cartilage. So synovial joints are actually protected by a articular cartilage. So this helps in what? The supporting of the ligaments and the limited movement to prevent injury. There are 6 types of joints. Synovial gliding joint. This is the gliding joint. This is the gliding joint in the neck region. Then comes the hinge joint. This is the in the hand elbow movement is the hinge joint. Then comes the pivot joint which helps in the rotation. This is the pivot joint. Then comes the condyloid joint which forms a circular motion, flexion and extension. Then comes a saddle joint. Saddle joint is there. That is, this is the saddle joint present in between the wrist region, and the ball and socket joint which joins the hip and the shoulder region. So this is the structure of what? The synovial joint. The synovial joints are enclosed by what? A outer region or covering, that is a joint capsule. So this region is known as what? The joint capsule. So this joint capsule inner lining is having a synovial membrane. So inside this joint capsule is a protective bag or a sac that minimizes friction and nourishes the cartilage. So joint capsule protect the bones and nourishes the cartilage. Inside the joint capsule, there is a synovial membrane. So this is the synovial membrane. So the synovial membrane actually helps in the production and the synthesis of a jelly-like fluid substance that is known as what? Synovial fluid. So this synovial fluid actually helps in the lubrication and to reduce the friction between the movement of the two bones, that is the femur, suppose the femur or tibia and fibula. So actually it helps in what? The friction, minimizes the friction of the bones or helps in the prevention of the erosion of the bones. And here you can see the articular cartilage is present. So there are around 230 synovial joints in the body. Then comes the pivot joint, then hinge joint, gliding joint, ellipsoidal joint, saddle joint, and the ball and socket joint. The six bone joints I have mentioned: radius, ulna, clavicle, scapula, tarsals, metatarsals. These all bones are having a particular movement of joint. The bones of the shoulder girdle are known as the scapula and the clavicles. The shoulder girdle connects what? The bones of the upper limbs to the axial skeleton, and the bones also provides what? Attachment for the muscle that moves the shoulder and the upper limb. So this is the scapula, also known as shoulder blade, and this is the shoulder girdle. Bones of the upper limbs are the humerus, arm bones. Forearm bones are the radius and ulna. So this is the radius and ulna, and the wrist bone and the hand bone. The only bone of the arm is the what? The humerus, which actually joined with the forearm bone, the radius and ulna at the elbow joint. So this humerus and the forearm bone that is having radius and ulna actually forms what? The joint movement of this elbow. The ulna is larger of the two forearm bones. So ulna and radius, between the ulna and radius, the ulna is only bone which is larger than the radius bone. Then comes the wrist bones, comprises of 8 carpal bones. So this is the wrist bone which composed of 8 carpal bones. Mm, the 8 carpal bones of the wrist are the scaphoid, lunate, triquetral, pisiform, trapezoid, then trapezium, capitate, and hamate. So this is capitate, hamate, pisiform, triquetral, and in this position, there is a trapezium-like shape, scaphoid bone, lunate, and trapezoid. Hand bones are 8 bones in the wrist, as I have mentioned. 5 bones at the palm region that contains metacarpals, and the fingers are having phalanges. That is, the 14 bones form fingers and the thumbs. The pelvic girdle, as I have mentioned, is having a region of ilium, pubis, and this is the ischium. Each hip bone is large. These are large, flattened, and irregular in shape, and infused with 3 types of bone. That is this is ilium, pubis, and the ischium. So what is the difference between female and the male pelvis? Female pelvis actually are having larger and wider structure in nature in compared to the male pelvis. So this is the male pelvis and this is the female pelvis. So these are the lower limbs that consist of femur. This is the patella, this is the tibia and the fibula, and the foot bones are the tarsals, metatarsals and the phalanges. Foot bones, as I mentioned, consist of the tarsal bones of the ankles. These are the phalanges, that is the toes, and these are the metatarsals present in between the tarsals and the phalanges. As in the hand, the foot has the 5 metatarsals, 5 proximal phalanges, 5 distal phalanges, only 4 middle phalanges, as the foot's big toe has only 2 phalanges. Ankle bones. The ankle bones or the tarsus consist of 7 tarsal bone. Calcaneus, talus, cuboid. This is the calcaneus, that is the heel bone. Then the cuboid, this is the talus region, navicular bone, and the cuneiforms. And these 3 cuneiforms are there. Foot arcs. So there are 3 types of arc that the foot are having. That is the transverse arc, this is the longitudinal arc, and the longitudinal arc in lateral. So this arcs of the foot actually helps in what? The support of the body weight and distribute the stress evenly during the work. So the transverse arc of the foot runs across the cuneiforms and the base of the metatarsal bones. The longitudinal arc of the foot runs from the calcaneus and to the head of the metatarsals and has the medial and the lateral parts. So these are the references, and thank you.